Hello, this is Jay Snyder, and I'm reading Reflections on the Public Interpretation of Regional Environmental History in Western Pennsylvania by Chris J. Magoc. This essay attempts to counter the scarcity of efforts to address issues of natural resource extraction and environmental exploitation in public history forums. Focused on Western Pennsylvania, it argues that the history of industrial development and its deleterious environmental impacts demands a regional vision that not only frames these stories within the ideological and economic context of the past, but also challenges residents and visitors to consider this history in light of the related environmental concerns of our own time. The essay explores some of the difficult issues faced by public historians and practitioners as they seek to produce public environmental histories that do not elude opportunities to link past and present in meaningful words. The key words from the following would be climate change, Denora smog, Lake Erie fishing, oil industry, regional environmental history. Shortly after becoming director of a Pittsburgh Area Historical Society in 1994, one of the first projects I initiated was a walking tour of an old industrial community called Natrona. Situated 22 miles northeast of Pittsburgh, Natrona has since 1900 been home to steelmaking and in Union circles was remembered for the nearby assassination of Fanny Sellens, an organizer during the Great Steel Strike of 1919. Natrona owed its birth to a group of Philadelphia Quakers who in 1850 established the Pennsylvania Salt Manufacturing Company and built a large complex of Greek and Gothic Revival-style housing for its workers, which in 1985 was designated a National Historic District. For over 100 years, Penn Salt produced an array of chemical products, including DDT and military explosives. An impressive industrial history was, not surprisingly, accompanied by a grim environmental legacy. Stories of multicolored smoke pouring from Penn Salt stacks were common decades after the plant's closure in 1957. In oral history interviews, I learned of a dearth of vegetation in the town and that many workers in the copper refining building often, quote, came home green and wore woolen clothing year-round because cotton would have fallen apart. Thanks to constant exposure to acid. One resident joked darkly that we never had a mosquito problem in the town. More ominously, Penn Salt had dumped more than 400 tons of lindane pesticide waste just up the hill from the plant. After Penn Salt's closure, the adjacent steelmaker purchased the site as a dumping ground for its own waste. By the late 1970s, the municipality had declared the land Alsco Park, ALSCO. But in 1983, the Environmental Protection Agency gave it another designation, near the top of its national priorities list of hazardous waste sites slated for Superfund cleanup. As a rule, toxic waste and assassination are not inviting subjects for a walking tour. But with a grant from the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, I developed a small interpretive project with 2 wayside markers and a brochure that encompassed the industrial, architectural, social, and environmental history of Natrona. Guided tours in those years invariably included someone with stories of growing up in the smoke-filled valley, including one participant who suspected that a serious illness had stemmed from having played in Alsco Park as a child. A small exhibit at our museum also featured Penn Salt, along with a sidebar on Silent Spring author Rachel Carson, who, ironically, was born in nearby Springdale. My organization's modest efforts appear now in hindsight indicative of a broader public history challenge that has emerged over the past couple of decades across the country. To preserve and interpret complex environmental histories in meaningful forms, applying what 2 scholars have called the translatory role of quintessentially multi- and interdisciplinary fields. As I found in Natrona, environmental history can bridge scientific knowledge with individuals' emotive sense of place in poignant and powerful ways. Creative projects offering multiple perspectives about the human impact on local environments can also resonate in the present, fostering the kind of civic dialogue that sociologists and museologists, that's a different word, I haven't run into that before, museologists, have long called for in public history. Recent efforts across the country offer promise in this regard. At the Smithsonian's Anacostia Museum, a 2013 exhibit titled Reclaiming the Edge examined local campaigns to restore and reimagine urban waterways in cities from Washington to Shanghai. The exhibit spoke to contemporary conservation values that have inspired the river's reclamation, as well as grassroots citizens' efforts to overcome resistant structures of political power. Natural history institutions like the American Museum of Natural History and the Cayuga Nature Center in Ithaca, New York, are becoming premier sites for illustrating the global as well as local and regional impacts of climate change. The National Park Service and art museums have also taken up that central environmental issue of our age. These encouraging developments suggest a new era of enlivened public engagement on pressing contemporary environmental concerns, along with initiatives like national heritage areas that are informed by cultural geography and environmental history. These kinds of projects suggest that natural resources and nature, broadly defined, are becoming increasingly prominent subject matters for a range of institutions. This is especially true in areas where history, personal identity, and local sense of place have been shaped by exploitive extraction of local natural resources or rapacious industrial development. Most of my life has been spent in such a place, Western Pennsylvania. Western Pennsylvania is defined here and extends about 150 miles from the shores of Lake Erie to the Monongahela River Valley of northern Appalachia, not far from the West Virginia border, and east about 75 miles from the Ohio state line. This is varied terrain embracing several distinct cultural landscapes, and yet it is bound with a regional coherence grounded in geography and its frontier history. Although western Pennsylvania straddles a major watershed divide, overland and watery transportation routes began to link Erie to the Pittsburgh area in the mid-18th century. The strategic geographic importance of western Pennsylvania prompted the building of a string of French forts from Presque Isle in Erie to Duquesne in Pittsburgh, and was key to the long European struggle for North American empire. Portaging goods overland and down the Allegheny to the Ohio River continued until the completion of the Beaver and Erie Extension Canal in 1844. Rail followed, advanced by the interests of regionally interlocking industrial titans, framed then by the hell-with-the-lid-off steelmaking valleys of the Pittsburgh area, north to what was once the most productive freshwater fishery on the planet in Erie. This broad swath of the Commonwealth helped fuel Pennsylvania's growth in the 19th and early 20th centuries. It is that deep and multifaceted history, resource extraction, heavy manufacturing, technological innovation, along with a sturdy work ethic and cultures of generations of immigrant workers who endured befouled waterways and polluted landscapes in exchange for a decent life for their families. That, together, forms the core of Western Pennsylvania's regional identity, and which has inspired much of the place-based heritage tourism that has developed here since the 1980s. Beyond the opening snapshot of Natrona, this essay examines the public interpretation of several regional stories of national significance. Commercial fishing in Erie, the lumber boom of Forest County, the birth of the oil industry in Oil City slash Titusville, and the ill-famed Denora smog of 1948 in the heavily industrial Pittsburgh area. We get a glimpse here of what a range of institutions have achieved to date when interpreting their respective histories. I seek to raise questions about what public environmental history within a historically distinctive region looks like, and perhaps how it might be reimagined. Most critical for me is how institutions might tell these stories within the ideological and economic context of their time, and also, at the same time, challenge us to revisit this history in light of the issues facing us in our own. Do the environmental crises of our age demand that we seek opportunities to challenge the public to think anew about how we got here? And if so, how? This next section is titled The Fishing Capital of the World. Arguably, the most dramatic episode of rapid environmental change in western Pennsylvania's history is the meteoric rise and steep collapse of Erie's fishing industry. After modest beginnings by the 1870s, steam-powered tugboats had made fishing a successful enterprise on Lake Erie and in Presque Isle Bay, the body of water formed by the 10-mile-long peninsula that offers one of the greatest natural harbors in the world. By 1920, Erie's bayfront boasted several ice houses for storing the fish, a dozen processing plants, and more than 120 fishing vessels hauling in staggering volumes of blue pike, whitefish, cisco, and white bass. Erie's citizens must have thought it would last forever. It did not. At first, the collapse of the industry was imperceptible to those not doing the fishing. But as early as the 1940s, the markets could no longer count on the same bounteous catches from Lake Erie. Sporadic decline soon became precipitous. In 1955, fishermen hauled in more than 2 million pounds of the legendary blue pike. By 1965, only 10 years later, that number had tumbled to 43 pounds. Various parties cast blame in multiple directions, including the rise of recreational fishing after World War II, ecologically disruptive invasive species, and the equally unwanted Canadian fishermen. Biologists and industry veterans fixed their attention on overfishing of particular species, and especially pollution. Decades of industrial effluent and municipal raw sewage, as well as non-point sources, phosphate-laden agricultural runoff, and sprawling suburban development, combined to help kill the fishing industry. Sources of industry like Hammermill Paper Company, a major employer, proved more of a witch's brew of sulfides, mercury, solids, and chlorinated organic compounds that poured from the plant into the lake. One of its well injection sites for disposing of wastes later made the National Superfund list. All of these forces combined to bring the death of Lake Erie to the pages of Dr. Seuss's The Lorax and the National Environmental Agenda by the end of the 60s. As elsewhere in the country, Erie citizens organized. In the wake of the first Earth Day, more than a dozen groups formed locally, a number of them working to track the source of pollutants and pushing for governmental action at all levels. Leaders of what became the Erie County Environmental Coalition were active in the U.S.-Canadian organization, Great Lakes United, and later successfully pursued designation of Presque Isle Bay as an EPA area of concern, after tumors and other deformities were discovered in a variety of fish. Despite the notable place of Lake Erie, Presque Isle Bay in U.S. environmental history, visitors to the city today find little evidence on the landscape that there was even a fishing industry here. Nearly every structure associated with all of Erie's maritime industries has been demolished over the past several decades in the city's effort to reinvent itself. The bayfront is now a tourist locale dominated by hotels, restaurants, and private boat docks. Its singular history site is the Erie Maritime Museum, the EMM, home port to the U.S. brig Niagara, a 1980s reconstructed version of Oliver Hazard Perry's victorious transfer ship in the 1813 Battle of Lake Erie. Opened in 1998 and operated by the Historical Museum Commission in partnership with local organizations, the EMM emphasizes the War of 1812 and Erie's subsequent rich naval history. As the site's educator in the late 1990s, I became absorbed in that history and learned the impossibility of any other thematic focus. Though Perry was in Erie for just a few months and the battle took place 150 miles from Erie, he has been feted with hagiographic enshrinement in the area for more than a century, and today's Niagara is an important material emblem of local pride and patriotism. What museum visitors learn of the Lake Erie's environmental history is located in an exhibit in the outer foyer, free to the public, but segregated from the core exhibitions. Produced by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, it offers an effective, if thin, overview of the Great Lakes' environmental history. The exhibit is not part of the standard tour. Visitors enter the museum through the gift shop, naturally, few noticing its presence. Inside, a fishing exhibit extends down a hallway separate from the central area and limited largely to the evolution of fishing techniques. One panel suggests briefly the demise of the industry through a complex of forces. The museum is engaged in an impressive range of environmental education initiatives, including promoting its own building as an excellent example of sustainably oriented brown space remediation and adaptive reuse of existing historical structures. As current educator Linda Bola notes, in addition, Niagara voyages every summer with college students conducting scientific research on current issues affecting the lake, not the least of which was the first survey in 2012 of the problem of microplastics pollution in Lake Erie. There are now plans for a subsequent exhibit on this very issue. Apart from the museum, the Tom Ridge Environmental Center, Tom Ridge is from Erie and was a former Pennsylvania governor, opened in 2006, and it serves as a scientific educational facility welcoming visitors to Presque Isle State Park. Although it features state-of-the-art exhibits on the park's ecology and natural history, the center avoids any mention of human-induced environmental degradation, save a section about invasive species. A Pennsylvania Seaway trail marker offers a brief and rather sanguine summary of the fishing story, the lake's polluted history, and its recovery. Finally, synthetic statues of a thoroughly saltwater dolphin and a sea lion punctuate the scene overlooking Presque Isle Bay, almost willfully confusing visitors and residents about what sort of maritime history may or may not have transpired here. Seeking in part to address this glaring void on the bayfront, the Public History program at Mercyhurst University is developing a collaborative project to interpret major themes of Erie history throughout the urban landscape. The project, Erie Places, Erie Stories, is partly inspired by a Mercyhurst student who in 2007 developed a driving tour of the Lake Erie watershed and the environmental history of the area. Portions of that tour will be incorporated into this citywide project that will feature a strong bayfront presence, engaging wayside markers enlivened by oral memories of fishermen and grassroots activists, as well as eco-history geocaching and an interactive social media. Beyond presenting the history, the new interpretation aspires to challenge visitors to consider the consequences of, for example, the non-point source pollution here to which we all remain connected. The interpretive vision of Erie Places, Erie Stories positions natural resources and the environment as key to Erie's development, doing so in part by emphasizing the significance of the lake and the regional watershed, both historically and for a healthy, sustainable future in northwest Pennsylvania. Next, we move on to timber. 60 miles southeast of Erie sits Forest County, which for much of the last third of the 19th century boasted rates of timber production rivaling any region in the world. In 2012 to 13, two students and I collaborated with the director of the Forest County Visitors Bureau on a project to develop a driving tour of the county's significant historic sites and a series of interpretive panels at the Visitors Center. From these two core products, local staff then developed a series of 8 wayside markers located at key locations throughout the county. Natural resources are at the center of Forest County's past and its present. Carved by the Allegheny and Clarion rivers, the steep hills are exquisitely beautiful in any season. A fully recovered recreation and tourism landscape now represents the economic lifeblood of the region. Profoundly linked to that natural world, Native American peoples have had a presence in the area that reaches back hundreds of years. Early American pioneer history here is steeped in legendary tales of brave men and women wresting a living from a fearsome wilderness. The county's most compelling history, however, is centered on the taking of the forest. An excerpt of one panel for the Visitors Center display is representative of the larger theme. That excerpt follows. A rich industrial heritage. As early as the 1840s, portable steam engines allowed circular sawmills to produce as much as 10,000 board feet of timber per day. A half-century later, few areas of the world were producing as much lumber as Forest County. T.D. Collins Bandsaw Mill at Nebraska produced boards as long as 85 feet to help build tall bridges in the late 1880s. Workers there sawed staggering volumes of pine and beech in those years, often more than 100,000 feet in a single day. Complementary images of massive log rafts containing astounding volumes of timber reinforce the area's single-minded focus on the conquest of nature, a dominant impulse that ultimately rendered the entire north-central region of the state the Pennsylvania desert, setting the stage for the recovery of the forest in the 20th century. When this interpretation turned toward the additional ancillary industries of oil and natural gas production, I discovered the interpretive limits of the project. This passage speaks to the continuation of the industry in the region. And this is taken from another document. Although natural gas production in the county reached a peak in 1931, natural gas continues to be developed throughout the county. In recent years, intensive development of natural gas contained in the multi-state Marcellus Shale region through the technological process of hydrofracturing, now known colloquially as fracking, has been driving a resurgence in the industry in parts of the county. Not included in this proposed additional sentence, although, and this is a quote, although technologically advanced, hydrofracturing is emerging not without environmental impact, and as elsewhere, is meeting resistance from opponents of the controversial practice in the Allegheny National Forest. That is lifted from the original draft of this article. I thought the passage rather innocuous and the point essential to note, particularly given the notoriety fracking has earned these days. Indeed, my initial inclination was to fully develop the storyline in ways that might link the past and the present. My FCVB colleagues' rejection of the initial passage preempted such ideas. From her standpoint, getting folks to Forest County to understand and appreciate its history was the primary goal, and anything that interfered or broached that anything that interfered or broached contentious contemporary issues was potentially counterproductive to that objective. As she later explained to me, this project was never intended to address environmental or social issues. Despite my fundamental disagreement with that position, the project did address environmental and social issues of the past, which are irrevocably bound to the present. This did not diminish the overall value of the project. Telling an environmentally centered regional history on the landscape is itself significant, precisely the sort of project we aspire to tell in Erie. The panels and the subsequent wayside markers offer a multi-layered history in which it is impossible not to see the complex dualities at work in this story. They tell of technological innovation and short-sighted plundering, brave entrepreneurship and reckless destruction, extraordinary production and heedless consumption. Moreover, the thread of an emerging American environmental stewardship rescuing and renewing the forest after a century of plunder shines through in the accomplishments of the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, timber barons heirs who preserved one of the last stands of old-growth forest in the East, and Howard Zanesser, Forest County native and 1964 Wilderness Act champion, whose love of wilderness was born in Forest County. Telling these stories on the same ground where trees were once rendered into seemingly limitless board feet of timber opens up the possibility of inducing thoughtful visitors to consider the long-term consequences of past deforestation. And next we move on to oil. This section is titled Oildom. The short drive from timber to oil country is a lovely journey through winding valleys and steeply hilly terrain thickly covered with forest. It was not so in 1865. Shortly after the close of the Civil War, Harper's New Monthly magazine sent a reporter to the oil region of northwest Pennsylvania, already known through the industrialized world variously as Petrolia, Oil Dorado, or Oildom. The reporter described the place thusly. And a reminder, this is from the reporter's dispatch. The soil is black, being saturated with waste petroleum. The engine houses, pumps, and tanks are black, with the smoke and soot of the coal fires, which raise the steam to drive the wells. The shanties, for there is scarcely a house in that whole 7 mile of oil territory along the creek, are black. The men that work along the barrels, machinery, tanks, and teams are white men, blackened. Even the trees, which timidly cling to the sides of the bluffs, wore the universal sooty covering. Their very leaves are black. As historian appropriately named Brian Black has written, what we might perceive as a grim characterization of the region was then conveyed first and foremost as a sign of the remarkably explosive growth of the industry that was changing the world. A marvel of the technological industrial sublime, Oildom's environmentally devastated landscape was celebrated as a dramatic indicator of the extraordinary progress the oil region portended for the nation. Americans embraced what would become a central tenet of their emerging industrial civilization, a willingness to sacrifice local environments for the promise of wealth and an improved material life. The nation received that and more from the valley that changed the world. In a little more than a decade following Colonel Edwin Drake's drilling of the world's first commercially successful oil well in 1859, the Oil Creek Valley produced more than 56 million barrels of oil, generating $17 million in gross revenue. I wonder what that would be in today's dollars. The region's oil boom led to the birth of the oil industry that transformed the world in ways the Colonel could never have imagined. Today, that story is told at the Drake Well Museum in Titusville, a Pennsylvania Historic Museum Commission-administered site, and the more modest Venango Museum of Art, Science, and Industry in Oil City. Drake Well's new permanent exhibition, opened in 2012, bears the title, "There's a Drop of Oil and Gas in Your Life Every Day." After taking visitors through the geologic origins and constitution of petroleum, the exhibition explores Native American uses of oil, early innovative petroleum pioneers, and the evolution of drilling techniques. The exhibition is multi-layered and engaging, examining the interplay of technological development, the growth and social disruption of the regional boom-bust oil economy, irresistibly compelling incendiary disasters that engulfed entire communities in fire, the growth of the industry well beyond Pennsylvania, and the economic manipulation of the industry led by John D. Rockefeller. Artifact-rich, the installation also features dramatic images, extensive primary source material, compelling dioramas, and an overall effective interactivity. Further, Drake Well delivers masterfully on its central theme, the transformational power and dominance of oil in modern life. As one panel declares, oil and natural gas have forever changed how we work, where we live, how we travel, maybe even the air we breathe. What would life be like without them? Visitors learn of the industry's virtually continuous process of scientifically engineered innovation that has delivered much of our material world. What can we make from oil and gas, one panel asks. Today, thanks to petroleum chemistry, our lives include synthetic medicine, manufactured wood, and sticky notes. There is a picture, an actual picture accompanying this in the article, a scene from the heart of oildom, capturing well the productive and blackened landscape typical of the region through the height of the oil boom. And the image comes from the Drake Well Museum. And it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 oil derricks and a couple little shanties stuck into the side of a hill that is completely black. Nostalgic images of lustrous 1950s cars and roadside architecture celebrate the American auto love affair that is at the heart of oil's story. The possibility of life without oil, we conclude, is simply unthinkable. The exhibition's final sections address some of the hard realities of the oil age. They do so in part by necessarily giving the limitations of gallery space, collapsing the last 4 or 5 decades of geopolitically complex and increasingly violent oil history with summary statements. For example, we learn that because petroleum is the blood of military power, dependence on foreign oil can become a national security issue. When supplies are threatened, countries go to war to protect their sources. Although both Drake Well and the Venango Museum arguably do well simply to acknowledge the connection between fossil fuels, the American way of life, and at least vaguely global U.S. military power, this sort of opaque phrasing is not especially enlightening or useful in thinking about today's challenges. The Pennsylvania Historic Museum Commission staff intends to more fully develop this immense story in an expanded future gallery. This is encouraging for the need to offer American museum goers a candid exploration of the manifold historic and contemporary connections between oil, war, and the growth of the U.S. military establishment seems urgently needed and long overdue. A concluding gallery at Drake Well braves the cold geophysical facts of diminishing fossil fuel supply and illustrates the ongoing search for a more diversified energy future. Here we also see evidenced a primary educational objective of the Historical Museum Commission staff to have visitors look at their own personal consumption, to convey to visitors their own role in the statistics of depletion. As one panel puts it bluntly, the U.S. produces 7 million barrels of oil a day, and we use 20 million barrels a day. And there is a picture with this section of the article. Exhibits at both the Venango Museum of Art, Science, and Industry and Drake Well Museum illustrate colorfully America's love affair with the automobile that lies at the heart of the story of our national dependency on oil. And there is an old Duesenberg, old car, and a lot of signs from Pennzoil and other oil companies displayed on the walls. The exhibit urges recycle, reduce, reuse, and then offers a brief survey of alternative technologies which could supplement, though one deduces never replace, the central role of oil in our society. With visitors imagining what will our energy future be, their answer gropes for something more satisfying than the exhibition can honestly offer. Although the search for oil and natural gas may have caused acid rain, oil spills, and global warming, it is hard to imagine a completely petroleum-free future. Indeed, it is. Particularly after the exhibition's tour of an all-chemical wonder-world of utopian plastics, convenience, leisure, and mobility, from which no rational person would ever want to escape. The museum settles for what feels like an unsettling mix of sanguine reassurance and ineffably terrifying implications. The Venango Museum of Art, Science, and Industry reinforces that ambivalent theme through a short film funded by the American Petroleum Institute. Fuel-less, that's the title of the movie, follows Crystal, a young teenager who wakes up one day to discover that, much to her horror, she is fuel-less. No hairdryer, no makeup, no gas, and her dress is a burlap sack. Crystal's teacher enlightens her as to the means by which oil is refined and magically transformed into the phenomenal products of her existence. The film urges individual responsibility and assures that commensurate corporate stewardship is well in hand. Crystal is told that the new standards have been adopted to prevent the icky oil spills that she used to see on television, and that bacteria can now eat any oil that somehow might, you never know, get into the ocean. The oil-blackened landscape of 1865 oildom is not in evidence on the pristine and tree-covered landscape of Drake Wells grounds. Here one sees blacksmiths hammering at replicated small rigging operations, a restored verdant heritage museum, and a landscape that belies even the despoiled place of yesteryear pictured in the museum. Such quaint verisimilitude of the glory years is delightful and educational, but I could not somehow help thinking how it serves to further insulate visitors from present-day threats associated with the same industry. The horrors of oil refineries in places like Nigeria, for example, or the climate crisis to which our dependence on sticky notes continues to contribute. Every time I drive away from oildom in my own gas-powered machine, I find myself asking this question: how much can one reasonably ask of a museum situated in the heart of historic oil country? Drake Well site Administrator Melissa Mann and curator-historian Susan Beetz argue that the museum needs to meet people where they are, which in their charitable characterization is uninformed about even the source of their energy. Never mind the global climate changing, defense budget swelling implications of their consumption. Mann and Beets hope the site not only educates about the history and the sources of American energy supply, but also strengthens their ability to think critically about what they hear on television and read in websites about energy-related issues. That mission is extended through a traveling educational program called the Mobile Energy Educational Training Unit. The acronym is MEET-U, a 44-foot-long trailer of exhibits that has traveled to schools and energy industry events throughout a 3-state region. MEET-U educates children about the history, technology, and contemporary challenges of America's energy supply. Approximately 75% of the funding for this program comes, no surprise, from the fossil fuel industry. Mann and Beets state without hesitation that the connection between the industry and Drake Wells ends there. Moreover, they're adamant that Drake Well does not serve as the mouthpiece for the industry. They cite the fact that source material for MEET-U and portions of the exhibition at Drake Well derive from the U.S. Department of Energy, the DOE, which they assert is a scientifically unimpeachable, objective, and independent source of information on all issues that are energy-related. That assumption appears to discount the historically entwined relationship of the DOE to the industry. The appointment in 2013 of Ernest Moniz, a physicist with deep connections to the oil and gas industries, as DOE Secretary, reflects what agency critics have long described as an industry-cozy relationship. So how much can one reasonably ask of a local museum in an area with a complex environmental and industrial history? What is the purpose and function of a local or regional museum when it comes to important questions of natural resources and the environment? These questions, at the heart of this essay, were left uneasily unanswered for me. PHMC's staff, recalling that Drake Well was established in 1934 by the American Petroleum Institute, the API, proudly assert the evolution of the site from what was largely an API organ that unabashedly promoted the interests of the oil industry to a more scientifically well-grounded educational institution whose mission is to educate and challenge its visitors to think critically. Compared to what I recall from a visit to the Drake Well in the early 90s, the museum has indeed come a long way in its interpretation. However, my conversation with staff suggested that for those of us asking for more, perhaps too much, Drake Well's mission to stoke critical thinking remains somewhat hamstrung and circumscribed by both the institution's location in the historic heart of the industry's birth and by the deeper politics of contemporary energy extraction in the in the United States. I picked up the wrong page. Bates offered sweeping condemnation of Josh Fox's controversial Gasland film. Moreover, she asserted that fracking opponents are simply and grossly misinformed about the geology and technological prowess of the practice that allows the industry to safely extract this essential fuel from deep in the earth. Mann acknowledged that there are problems with the industry, but it's important, she said, to not judge the industry on what we do not know. History, and we might hope some future Drake Well exhibit, will render conclusions on the ramifications of an industry that has drilled more than 80,000 hydrofracturing wells across the country since 2005 and produces more than 200 billion gallons of toxic wastewater every year. Moreover, it seems important to acknowledge that at least part of where people are right now on the issue of fracking is worried and angry. The Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, DEP, received between 2011 and 2014 more than 2,000 complaints from Pennsylvania residents related to the industry, most of them having to do, not surprisingly, with alleged water contamination. It seems impossible to not conclude that the site, an impressive installation and generally asserted confidence in the objectivity of its interpretation and educational programming, remains at least partially, if unconsciously, captive of the long reaches of the interests that birthed the Drake Well some 80 years ago. And there is a picture, black and white picture of an early gas pump. Such quaint verisimilitude of the glory years of the oil industry is delightful and educational, but it seems to further insulate visitors from present-day threats associated with the same industry. This chapter is titled, "There Was a Dead Silence, Donora." During the last days of October 1948, a killer smog fell on the towns of Donora and Webster, Pennsylvania. Air polluting emissions, long accepted fact of life in western Pennsylvania industrial communities, became trapped by a temperature inversion at concentrated levels so high they proved lethal. A smothering blanket of warm air trapped the cooler surface air permeated by heavy concentrations of hydrogen fluoride and sulfur dioxide. Amid an already environmentally desolate landscape, there was now darkness at noon and a dead silence, as one resident recalled. After 4 days, 21 residents were dead, 800 animals had perished, and more than 6,000 people had become ill. Many more in the years ahead died prematurely. Although most local residents were reluctant to blame the calamity on emissions coming from the American Steel and Wire Company's zinc works, the town's main employer, the Donora tragedy prompted waves of shock and sympathy from around the world, and in the United States inspired a growing national call for stronger air pollution laws. The Donora disaster ultimately helped to produce the landmark Clean Air Act of 1970. But what truly purified the air of the Monongahela Valley, through which the Monongahela River flowed, was the flight of industry from the region, a fact that complicates the legacy of the event. The zinc works, long suspected as the major culprit of the lethal gaseous mix that enveloped the valley, closed within a decade of the disaster. Many local residents subsequently joined the national chorus of voices blaming increasing environmental regulation for the loss of industrial jobs. And in that context, the 1948 Donora smog was best forgotten for most residents, a tragic reminder of what once was. Thus, the Donora Smog Museum appears all the more arresting. Not only does the facility tell the story of one of the worst public health disasters in U.S. history, it does so in the decimated heart of a community that has never recovered from the shock of deindustrialization that remains irrevocably tied to the events of 1948. Established in 2008, the museum resulted from both the need of the Donora Historical Society for a new physical home and the creation of the Donora Commemorative Smog Committee, organized to mark the 60th anniversary of the air pollution disaster. The Historical Society's new smog museum is located in an old storefront in a mostly vacant commercial district. Clean Air Started Here reads the subtitling under the museum's name, a clear indication of the Historical Society's appreciation of the smog's significance and an acknowledgement that notwithstanding the birth of baseball great Stan Musial, it is the story most likely to draw visitors from beyond the community. Curator Brian Charlton makes clear that although the 1948 smog is front and center, it's only one part of Donora's history. Museum visitors see a broadly framed organizational mission reflected in exhibits illustrating the overall history of the zinc works, the city's rich ethnic diversity, its sports history, and more. Without question, however, the smog story is still the main attraction. Charlton reports that some visitors arrive on their way to the more notable tourist attractions like Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water just to see what a smog museum is. And there is an illustration with this section of the article. The Denora Smog Museum's exhibits illustrate the community's pride in its industrial heritage, as well as the important role of the 1948 Denora smog in inspiring the movement for clean air in the United States. Now, I need to admit that I lived in Monongahela for several years, which is the next town from Denora, but I missed the smog because we moved there early in the 1950s. Although the Historical Society welcomes the casual curiosity seekers, Charlton and other Historical Society leaders oversee the institution with an academic seriousness and a sense of civic purpose that would rival many larger, well-funded museums. The Denora Smog Museum has developed strong relationships with major institutions, including Pittsburgh's Heinz History Center and the Teaching with Primary Sources program of the U.S. Library of Congress. Academics from throughout the region also bring a range of disciplinary expertise to the museum's programs. The museum tells the 1948 smog story first through a poignant, powerful 4-minute film, A Town Called Denora, which was produced through a partnership with California University. The main exhibit is rich with photographs, news clippings, and a few telling artifacts, including a local Women's Club 1948 publication, the cover of which features a darkly colored polluted sky over the Denora Mills, an evocative reflection of the community's proud identification with its gritty, befouled industrial environment. Even as Charlton readily acknowledges the Spartan quality of the Society's exhibits, he proudly points to its historical search for the truth through the study of primary sources. Whatever it may take us, wherever we may go, unconcerned with who may be offended in the process. And there is a picture accompanying this section of the article. The community-inspired mural at the Denora Smog Museum exemplifies the vision of positive environmental change that the museum hopes to inspire. And it's a beautiful room-size mural that has the banner across it saying the Society for Better Living. To that end, the Smog Museum sponsored in 2013 an environmental conference featuring, among others, Denora native and epidemiologist Deborah Davis, whose critically acclaimed work has helped to shine a light on the long-term impacts of the smog and the efforts to obscure the industrial causes of the disaster. The museum's smog-related programs focus, Charlton says, is on the reality and the truth we learned from the smog disaster and the role it placed in launching the environmental movement itself. More important, he says, the smog allows us to make a clear and natural connection to contemporary environmental concerns. According to Charlton, the museum's hope is to learn the lessons of the smog disaster and apply them in an active and diligent way on issues ranging from the nation's energy needs to climate change. Be it ever so humble, what they are doing in Denora represents the noble heart of public history's potential to render historical narrative and memory in forms that can be transformational. So the article winds up with conclusions. Western Pennsylvania, as I have argued, is exquisitely fertile ground for offering the public a history of the human relationship with the natural world in ways that can challenge the understanding and expectations of residents and visitors in important ways. If sites of public history in Western Pennsylvania and other similar regions are to serve a constructive role as civic forums in helping to chart a more sustainable world, it seems essential that they do more than explain the history of human interaction with the environment. More than anything, we should hope that they seize every opportunity to make, as Denora's Brian Charlton asserts, clear and natural connections to contemporary environmental concerns. Museums hold, as Melissa Mann pointed out, a sacred trust, one that here bears an important civic responsibility to challenge ill-informed assumptions and raise appropriate and insistent questions from the past that bear on the present. When grounded in the evidence of both the historical record and the best independent environmental and social science, these sites can do more than position natural resources and the environment at the center of human history. This century of encroaching environmental crisis demands a scientifically based treatment of history in the public realm that does not shrink from difficult contemporary policy debates over the sustainability of natural resource consumption and extraction methods. We should embrace opportunities for active consideration of fundamental questions regarding human civilization in a post-carbon, climate-change world. There are no easy solutions here. Local museums and other conveyors of regional history for tourist consumption are constrained by the difficulties of raising adequate funds to deliver quality professional exhibits and programs they believe will draw and engage visitors. On the whole, the sites examined here make clear that regional public history institutions are taking seriously their growing responsibility to address environmental history. As Lisa Magetto has argued, environmental and public historians generally share a desire to produce work that will provide useful, not only understanding the past, but also addressing the problems of the present and the future. If environmental advocates or public historians believe institutions are falling short of what is possible, that seems all the more reason to actively seek, develop, and contribute to interpretive projects that can point the way toward positive environmental change, particularly at the local and regional level where change is most visibly evident and more personally felt. The history that lies under our feet in regions like western Pennsylvania calls us to an interpretation that might help stir the kind of civic engagement that is essential for a more sustainable future. And the author of that Reflections on Public Interpretation is Christopher J. Magoc, M-A-G-O-C, a professor and chair of the History Department at Mercyhurst University in Erie, Pennsylvania. He's the co-founder of the university's Green Team, and he teaches courses in environmental history and directs the Mercyhurst Public History program. Among his books are Chronology of Americans and the Environment, published by ABC Clio in 2011, Environmental Issues in American History, published in 2007, and Yellowstone, The Creation and Selling of an American Landscape from 1870 to 1903, published by the University of New Mexico Press in 1999. And this is Jay Snyder. I hope you have learned something. I certainly have. Thank you.